Hey guys, this is the one shot When the Party's Over by Withered, read by Confusions. They are not that different, he and Barnes. Not when Barnes' life seems like a distorted reflection of his own. Except where Tony has spent decades consciously boarding himself up from the storms of existing as he is. Barnes didn't have that luxury. Barnes had broken free from the shackles that Hydra placed on him in exchange for his name, and the world clamours for it. We can't protect him here, T'Challa tells Tony, his brows furrowed, his expression sombre. The king hadn't wanted it to come to this. That much is obvious. But Tony can't tell whether it's because he's grown fond of having the Winter Soldier as a house guest, or if it's because his only option for an aforementioned house guest is Tony. He thinks it might be a combination of both. There's too much going on top of all this media coverage, Shuri says grimly. Yasha can't stay here, not with them around too. And there's no trading off, unfortunately. Tony has some self-preservation, and from the way Barnes is twitching, Tony doesn't doubt but Barnes shares the same sentiment. He won't be any trouble, T'Challa assures. The triggers are no longer in effect. Of course not, Tony says, his smirk lazy. If there was anything that was going to crack that encryption, it would have been the princess. Shuri preens. Thanks for keeping your end of the bargain, all things considered. T'Challa returns smile is thin, tired, but Barnes' head snaps up like he scented blood in the water. You sent me here? At that Tony scoffs. Please, I'm not even allowed the air until everything's calmed down. Then, once the triggers were activated, I knew I didn't have the tech to deal with it, so I asked someone smarter. You're welcome, Shuri declares. While it only crosses Tony's mind to be worried that Barnes hadn't known that, he might have felt betrayed by the fact that it wasn't only T'Challa's sense of justice that had extended an offer of safety to him. Tony can't find it in himself. Betrayal only comes from friends, and Tony and Barnes aren't. They aren't friends when Barnes arrives in the compound less than a week later. They aren't friends when Tony shoots down the military trying to claim Barnes as an active service member. They aren't friends when Barnes protects Tony from an assassin attempt not 20 minutes later. And they aren't friends when, after being in the midst of a media firestorm, a hasty retreat back to the compound, and an anxiety attack of epic proportions from a guy who's been living in survival mode too long to be anything but dangerous when pushed too far, when it happens. It's being wrapping Barnes up in an experimental web shooter for Peter and activating Dark Knight protocols for Barnes to come down from the panic. Between Barnes' ragged breaths, he asks for his teeth. How did you... It's a lot, Tony explains softly, more intimately than it has any right to be, even if they've got a whole room between them. What is? Everything. Barnes' breath is starting to calm, but his rumpus sounds wounded, edged with confusion that's tinged in anger. So Tony elaborates. The world is too much, too bright, too loud, too insistent. Sometimes it helps to make things smaller, so it's just you. And you is the guarded reminder that rings in the silent question. Why? In the dark, Tony's lips curl into the corner, shapes his words into a parody of smiles. You think you're the only one with issues? Barnes replies with a gusty exhale. Can't imagine you want to make yourself small. I'm a larger-than-life kind of guy, Tony allows with some humour. But even I got to get back to the basics. To that Barnes didn't say anything, but Friday's already pinged Barnes' heart rate, and it's calm enough that Tony feels comfortable enough to ask. I'm going to turn some of the lights back on, alright? He waits, and after too many seconds, Barn hesitantly replies, okay. The lights are brightened slowly, the blackout blindings peeking just a little bit at the hems to let the outside world in. It's a gradual process, and through it, Tony tells him things. That this section of the compound is only for Avengers and Avengers in training, and that only Avengers around beside them at the moment is Bruce, who's in the lab. That this room can only be accessed by them right now, so it doesn't matter where Bruce is. But Tony thought Barnes would like to know. He also tells Barnes that he has the Iron Man suit on, the one Tony had used to get them back here. That he won't use it. He tells Barnes that he knows Barnes has several blades on him, and that Tony doesn't mind, but if Barnes could not use them when he cuts Barnes loose, that would be nice. I'm not gonna hurt you, Barnes says in reply. He sounds steadier, the edge of his stereo smoothened. Didn't think you would. Just thought I'd do my due diligence, and at that, Barnes chuckles. By the time the curtains are all rolled up and the lights switched off, indifferent to the sunshine streaming in, Barnes isn't as cagey looking. Tony telegraphs his movements and kneels in front of Barnes to start working off Peter's web shooters with a localized laser from his watch. They'd come almost directly from the tarmac on the compound to our congressional meeting, and up close, Barnes smells like an approaching winter storm and warm leather. Whenever this happens, Shuri usually tranks me, and when she doesn't, Barnes licks his lips, blue gaze flicking to catch Tony's deprivation chamber. I've got that, Tony says, and there's something complicated happening on Barnes's face, such that Tony's brows furrow in confusion, unless you prefer not to. And with his hands still behind his back, and Tony leans over to let his arms loose, Tony sees that Barnes's fingers twitch anxiously. Carefully, Tony sets his hand on Barnes' shoulder and is rewarded with a wide-eyed stare, this side of hopeful. They're not friends when Tony asks, Barnes, what is it you want? They're not friends when Barnes sucks in a breath and asks quietly, could you? They're not friends when Tony considers him, and their sense of steadiness Tony himself feels and says, yeah, okay. They are not friends, but they could be. Though Tony would like to state for the record that it was not his intention. He has enough friends, and he can certainly do without the rogue's brand of friendship. But Barnes isn't technically asking for it, and he isn't technically with rogues anyway. So it's only halfway to a bad idea, which means Tony missed the bus and gone full dumbass. At least that's what Roddy says. It's not like Tony's getting his wires crossed here. There's nothing sexual about what he and Barnes do. Even the occasion where Barnes wants, begs to be tied up. What mostly happens is that Tony makes the world smaller, shuts down all the lights, encases Barnes in darkness, creates the newest generation of noise-cancelling headphones, makes the clothes around the compound, building him blanket forts, and doesn't bat an eye when Barnes wants to hide under Tony's workshop bench. They don't even touch when Barnes needs these things from Tony, though Tony almost always talks. Sometimes when the darkness doesn't help, that seems to. It's kind of ironic given how often people shut him out or ignore him when he does. but Barnes clings to Tony's voice like a lifeline. And it's different, for a lack of better words. He doesn't get to help people like this. He's such a disaster on every level, it's not like anyone will trust him to. Sure, they go to him when they need the world saved, but this is a little too personal, a little too intimate. There's a lot of trust involved in what's happening, and Tony isn't used to it. That doesn't mean he doesn't like it, though. He doesn't feel special at the thought of being charged with something important on the basis that they don't trust anyone else to do it with. But you. It doesn't occur to Tony how much he likes it, though, until Barnes graduates from no contact to all contact, from the same time the rogues are brought back. Roguers try to shake Tony's hand and then just pales and doesn't. In fact, all the rogues look a little fidgety now, the witch included. And at first Tony thinks Roddy's radiating pissed off mama bear vibes, which, rude, you're the one who made me do this in the first place, gumdrop. And then he realizes it's actually Barnes, doing a very impressive impersonation of a vengeful spirit hovering at Tony's shoulder. Tony thinks it's some latent protective quality brought on by helping Barnes out, but then Barnes starts to get touchy, and suddenly it's a thing. Whether it's just standing at Tony's shoulder or tugging him gently with a hand on his back or hip, Tony assumes it's a reminder to the rogues that Barnes is on Tony's side now, and no shit talking will be tolerated. One time, rogues try to talk to Barnes, and Tony's name comes up. The conversation deteriorates on itself. There's a dent in the wall as evidence, in fact, as well as a trend on some apps where people body check each other to the tune of, "What you say?" as the screen goes psychedelic. Apparently it's a vintage meme culture, out of respect for their age, because Friday's always watching, and the internet is her playground. Shuri isn't clearly a massive influence in this pop culture moment. To Chella's eyes, like he is the absolute furthest from being surprised. Nonetheless, internet fame aside, Tony's glad. He's happy, actually. Tony has another friend claim that isn't just built off hero work or for professional purposes. And it's good. Barnes doesn't take more than Tony gives, and Barnes doesn't make insensitive jokes about Tony's many failures in life as a person. And it's good. They're good. Graduating from casual touching to full-on coddling just seems like natural progress of things, really. Barnes needs to be grounded, fiddling and twisting in his seat under Tony's arm one day, and it just makes sense to hug him, especially since the room had already been dimmed and Friday had silenced the television. With a breath that warms Tony's chest, Barnes shifts in his arms before he's pulling Tony on top of him entirely. Tony's only response to this arrangement is to pet his hair and make soothing noises around Barnes' little whimpers, because Tony's tired and Barnes is warm, and despite the super soldier's muscle definition, Barnes makes a great pillow. Later, when Rodley walks in, he shakes his head and refuses to be involved, which, joke's on him, is a terrible idea, because Barnes gives the best hugs. Tony would know. He's had Rodley's hugs after all, and because Tony hasn't said no, it happens again and again. When Barnes eventually gathers up the courage to sink into Tony's room, draped in shadow and dressed in his favourite pyjamas, Tony doesn't react anymore to flip the sheets up to invite Barnes into his bed. the natural progression of things. With some help, the pillows are arranged in a veritable fort that Barnes makes himself home in, and adjusts just enough that his head ends up in Tony's lap. Tony merely hums, pretending to be distracted by his start pad, and reaches out to soothe his fingers through Barnes's hair. "Long day, Wonderland?" Is Barnes' reply, his eyes already slipping shut between Tony's attention. He always goes soft whenever it's just the two of them. He already doesn't talk much, but Barnes goes outright non-verbal like this. Tony would be worried, but Barnes only seems quietly content. It's expected, really, now that Tony knows Barnes a little better. But despite his murderous magnetism and terrifying reputation, Barnes is even more of an anxious mess than Tony is. And talking means that there's always the possibility he can say something wrong. So Barnes avoids it. Tony respects it because he understands it. He doesn't think Barnes gets that a lot. People either see him as the Winter Soldier or Bucky, Captain America's sidekick. No one ever sees him just like this. The thought has Tony muffled the sadness threatening to blow his chest open because Tony's a stay on himself. There's no denying that, but he's never been alone, not truly. Tony had Anna, Edwin, Jarvis, and he had Rodley, Pepper, Happy, the Bots, his Als, Yinsen, Harley, Peter. Even when he was too deep into the pit of his own worst impulsions to realize it, he's always had someone to care, to see him for who he is, and in this moment, Barnes has Tony. It's a realization he holds, cautious but persistent in his palms. Like a bird not meant to be caged, but wanting to be held anyway, Tony does his best to comply. Weaving Barnes's hair into a loose braid, Tony tells him quietly, "You're not alone anymore. I've got you. You're safe." And if it were possible for Barnes to melt, he would have. His sigh seems to dispel the remaining tension he's holding in. He squeezes Tony's hand in his, and if to prevent Tony from leaving, as if he ever could. And with a kiss on his temple, Tony promises, "I'll be right here, darling. I'm not going anywhere." Alright, so that's it for this fic. I hope to see you next time.